In this video, I want to examine the character of Oedipus, who is the tragic hero of the Greek play Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex as it's sometimes called. It was written by the ancient Greek playwright Sophocles, and I think it's fair to say that it's probably his most famous work. The psychologist Sigmund Freud popularized the term Oedipus complex, and he used this play as an example of what he was trying to show about psychoanalysis and the unconscious. Freud's theories have been challenged by other psychologists, and I think he's considered somewhat of an outdated thinker now. But the Oedipus complex and Oedipus himself has worked its way into the 21st century mythos regardless, largely because of Freud's use of the term. It's well known that Oedipus was a legendary king of ancient Thebes who inadvertently ended up killing his own father and then marrying his own mother. The play by Sophocles, which has been lauded throughout the centuries as really the standard by which we can judge other plays, specifically tragedies, is about Oedipus's discovery that he's done these terrible deeds. Now, because it's a play of discovery, not much action in the usual sense of the word takes place. There aren't car chases or explosions or anything like that. But the interest lies in each new revelation that Oedipus has, which culminates in the end in the great mystery of his parentage being brought to light. Because of this, the play relies heavily on dramatic irony. Now, dramatic irony is when the audience or the reader shares with the author knowledge of either present or future circumstances that the characters themselves don't know. Now, keep in mind that for original audiences of the play, for the ancient Greeks, Oedipus's story would have already been well known. His family history was part of a collection of Greek myths known as the Theban cycle, which were as familiar to the ancient Greeks as the stories about, say, the Trojan War. Kind of like how everybody today in the American culture probably knows at least the bare bones basics about figures like Spider-Man or Superman. So there are elements of the story that the audience going into a Spider-Man movie already know is going to happen. We don't need to see Uncle Ben die 30 times every time a new movie comes out, although we do. The audiences would have appreciated these moments in the play of dramatic irony that arise from their knowledge of Oedipus's backstory. For example, Oedipus vows in the beginning of the play to find and punish the murderer of the previous king of Thebes, not knowing that he himself is the murderer. Jocasta, his wife, tries to assure him that there's no truth to the prophecies of oracles through proofs of her own past, while the audience knows all along that the prophecy she's talking about is coming true as she speaks. She just doesn't know it. Anyway, the topic of this video is Oedipus's personality and the great flaw in his personality. But if you haven't read or seen the play before, I do want to briefly catch you up on the backstory so you'll know the context in which Oedipus is acting. So everything begins in the city of Thebes when King Laius and his wife Jocasta hear an oracle or a prophecy about their unborn son from the god Apollo. And the oracle isn't a good one. It says that their son will not only grow up to kill his father, but also to marry his mother. They're alarmed at this, naturally, and decide, once Oedipus is born, to abandon him in the wilderness on a mountainside. Because I guess that maybe they didn't have the heart to just kill him themselves, they entrust that task to a servant, one of their herdsmen. But the problem comes when the servant also doesn't have the heart to kill an infant. So instead of doing what the king and queen commanded him, he gives baby Oedipus to another herdsman that he knows. And this second herdsman is actually a citizen of the city of Corinth. And he takes that baby back to Corinth, where he's eventually adopted by the king and queen of that city. It's an interesting twist of fate, and worth thinking about, that Oedipus grows up as a prince anyway, in spite of his parents' attempt to murder him. So he grows up thinking that he's the son of the king and the queen of Corinth, And at some point, he hears the same oracle that came to his parents all those years ago, that he's going to kill his father and marry his mother. And so he flees in order to prevent the prophecy, and on his wanderings, he gets into a fight, and it's kind of a dumb fight, at a crossroads with a man and his servants. There isn't enough room for them both to pass by on the road. Neither one of them wants to give way, and Oedipus, who has a temper, as we'll see in a minute, draws his sword and ends up killing the nobleman and his servants. The nobleman, surprise, surprise, is none other than King Laius of Thebes, Oedipus's true father. But Oedipus doesn't know any of this at the time, and he continues about his merry way. He eventually comes to the city of Thebes, and he saves them from being terrorized by this mythological creature called the Sphinx. And the Sphinx should be familiar to you if you've seen pictures of Egypt. There's the giant statue of it there next to the pyramids in Giza. It's like a half lion, half female creature. So Oedipus saves Thebes from this creature, and he then marries the widowed queen, Jocasta, and has 4 children with her. Now, the play begins several years after these events, once the children are already pretty well grown. And as it begins, we're told that there's a plague in the city of Thebes. People are dying. Mothers aren't giving birth to their children. And it's even striking the non-human life of the city, too. Cattle are dying off by the hundreds. Crops aren't growing. It's a disaster. Oedipus has sent his brother-in-law, Creon, to the oracle of Apollo to see what the problem is. And the answer that they get, the answer from the gods, is that the plague is a result of religious pollution. The gods are offended because the murderer of the old King Laius was never found and properly punished as he should have been. And there's more to it than that, even. We find out later that the gods are also angry because the royal family has become tangled into an incestuous mess. This idea of religious pollution is something that I touched on in one of my previous videos, when God sends sickness. And it was when I was talking about Abraham's sojourn with King Abimelech in the book of Genesis. And we see that it's a common idea in the ancient world that pollution or sin on the part of the royal family or the head of state results in a nationwide plague. Abimelech had taken Abraham's wife, Sarah, for his own, not knowing that she was already married. And God sent a plague to his people, to his nation, as a warning that he was doing wrong and that he was about to commit this great act of evil. And Abimelech, like Oedipus, didn't know he was in the wrong at the time. And once he found out, he restored Sarah to Abraham. He complained a bit, rightly so, I think, saying, "Hey, why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" And he lets them go. And because of this, in Genesis, the plague leaves Abimelech's people. Things don't work out so well for Oedipus, largely because Oedipus, unlike Abimelech, doesn't have his heart in the right place. He has a high, proud spirit. And it's this spirit, more than anything, that leads to his downfall. Oedipus is strong, self-reliant, and wise. He tells us that all men call him great, and it's not an empty boast. We see that others really do hold him in this high esteem. He saved the city of Thebes from the Sphinx, not just by his strength, but by his wit as well. So his merits are well deserved. But the problem is that he thinks of himself as great as well. And this is most evident, I think, in the way that he conceives of himself in relation to the gods. He sees himself as the gods' champion, defending the purity of the city by trying to uncover the cause of the plague. Other characters, while giving him credit for his greatness, don't conceive of him as God's champion, his big, strong champion, but as God's servant instead. Listen to how the priest petitions him for his help at the beginning of the play. The priest says, "We have not come as suppliants to this altar because we think of you as of a god, but rather judging you the first of men in all the chances of this life and when we mortals have to do with more than man. You came, and by your coming saved our city, freed us from tribute which we paid of old to the Sphinx, cruel singer. This you did in virtue of no knowledge we could give you, in virtue of no teaching. It was God that aided you. Men say, and you are held with God's assistance to have saved our lives. Now, Oedipus, greatest in all men's eyes, here falling at your feet, we all entreat you, find us some strength for rescue. So, this speech is a speech where the credit is balanced. Oedipus gets his proper due. He's told that he's this great man and all people acknowledge him the first of men. But his greatness is kept in proportion to the greatness of the gods. Now listen to Oedipus's language after he learns about the reasons of the plague, or the reasons for the plague, rather, and decides to seek out Laius' killer. Oedipus says this: I'll begin again and bring this all to light. Fittingly, King Phoebus, that's Apollo, took this care about the dead, and you too, fittingly. And justly you will see in me an ally, a champion of this country and the god. For when I drive pollution from the land, I will not serve a distant friend's advantage, but act in my own interest. Whoever he was that killed the king may readily wish to dispatch me with his murderous hand. So helping the dead king, I help myself. Come, children, take your suppliant bows and go. Up from the altars now. Call the assembly and let the people of Cadmus meet, and know that I'll do everything. God will decide whether we shall prosper or shall fail. So he tacks it on in the end there, that God will decide whether or not they're successful or not. But the emphasis is all on Oedipus. I'll do everything. I'll begin again and bring all of this to light. I will be God's champion. There's an important difference here, I think, in the language. In Oedipus's mind, his role is one of action. It's of strength, and not of submissiveness. Even his devotion is tainted with his conception of himself as a man of action who's self-reliant, and he can't brook the notion that he's a servant of anybody. But we know that someone who thinks of themselves as self-reliant doesn't really need the gods at all. And so this positioning of himself as God's champion while outwardly noble is rather impious. And I wouldn't suggest that he's doing this on purpose, or that he's even conscious of it at all. This all goes back to the flaw in his character, I think. He is a man of action. He's always thinking ahead. He's always quick to act. We see that he sent Creon to inquire at the oracle before the priests and the suppliants even show up to the palace to request his assistance as the play begins. And again, later on, when the elders of Thebes ask him to seek out the prophet Tiresias for answers, we see that Oedipus has already thought ahead, and so Tiresias shows up right as they're asking for him. And this, incidentally, makes the action of the play move a lot quicker as well. So all of his intelligence and his strength has allowed pride to fester in his heart. His pride leads him to believe that he's above all others, even the gods, in knowledge. Listen to how he speaks disparagingly about the gods' knowledge later on in the play, when he learns that the king of Corinth, who remembers he believes is his father, has died. Let me find my place here. So he gets this terrible news, and he says, "Ah, oh dear Jocasta, why should one look to the Pythian hearth? Why should one look to the birds screaming overhead? They prophesied that I should kill my father, but he's dead and hidden deep in earth, and I stand here who never laid a hand on spear against him. Unless perhaps he died of longing for me, and thus I am his murderer. But they, the oracles, as they stand, he's taken them away with him. They're as dead as he himself is, and worthless." So this is overweening pride, bordering on blasphemy, to say that the oracles are worthless. Pride, or hubris, is the tragic flaw in not just Oedipus's character, but in many of the characters that one encounters in the ancient dramas. And this is what leads to his downfall, and the series of reversals that he experiences near the end of the play. He goes from being the forward thinker that doesn't listen to anyone, to having to literally be led around by everyone else. Because once the terrible truth comes out, Jocasta, the queen, hangs herself, and Oedipus sees this, and he stabs his own eyes out at the sight. So the man who everyone calls great is suddenly a tragic, pitiable figure. His strength is gone, his wisdom is gone, or at least his trust in his own wisdom is destroyed, and his self-righteousness is gone. Now, by self-righteousness, I mean Oedipus' sense of always thinking that he's in the right of things, of being self-reliant and able to take care of things for himself without depending on the help or the wisdom of others, be they gods or men. It's a bit of an expanded definition, I guess, from the way that the term is usually used, in which is to mean someone who feels like they're morally superior. I'm kind of using it to include that, but also someone who thinks that they're superior in any way. And I want to take a moment to examine the Christian application here. Self-righteousness is repeatedly condemned in the scriptures for this very reason. It prevents people from seeing when they're in the wrong, and they don't take the help that's being offered to them when they need it. In the book of Mark, it's chapter 2, verse 17, Jesus says that they that are whole have no need of the physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And the idea there is that the ones who think that they are righteous don't ask for help when they need it. Only the ones who will admit that they're sick or sinners and face the problem can get the problem solved. Oedipus, as we've seen, isn't just sick, he is the contagion in the land. He just doesn't know it. And when we get to the end of the play, he finds out the truth, and it breaks his pride, and he submits to the instructions of others, of the elders and of his brother-in-law Creon, which, if he had done in the first place, might have lessened the impact of the tragedy. And I think that that's one biblical lesson that we can take away from Oedipus the king, that self-sufficiency and self-righteousness can blind us to our faults because we're not orienting ourselves properly in relation to God. And this is true both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And I want to read two passages. I know that this is labeled as a literature study and not a Bible study, but there's a little bit of a blending here. The first passage that I want to read is in Luke, and it's Luke chapter 12, and starting at verse 16. And Jesus Christ is telling this parable about a self-sufficient man. Starting in verse 16, and he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then who shall those things be which thou hast provided? So in that parable, we have a man, like Oedipus, who thinks that he's secure and wealthy due to his own labor, but he's powerless to prevent his own death. Just like Oedipus, he thinks that his industry has made him untouchable, but he's wrong. Back in the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, in chapter 8, we have God talking to the nation of Israel before they come into the land that they're meant to inherit. And he says this, in verse 11, Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in not keeping his commandments, and his judgments, and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Lest, when thou hast eaten, and art full, and hast built goodly houses, and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents, and scorpions, and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, to do thee good at thy latter end. And thou say in thine heart, My power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. So again, we see mankind's tendency to get puffed up with pride and think that all of our goods and blessings come from our own efforts and not from anything that God's done for us. And God is reminding the Israelites there that no, the blessings are coming from him, not from anything else. So that's one lesson to take away from the play, I think. Another is that we shouldn't envy someone who seems to have it all, to be the top dog, because we never know what fortune is going to throw at us or at them. I think a lot of us can think of at least one person in our lives who seems to have everything together, who has things always work out for them, who's really kind of like Oedipus in this play. I'm thinking the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off just came into my head, where his sister is jealous because everything Ferris does seems to work out for him. He plays hooky from school, he goes on all these adventures, and he never gets caught. And she's saying, well, why does that always happen to him and not to me? Why do I have to obey all these silly rules and he doesn't? It's easy to kind of grow resentful of someone like Ferris Bueller or Oedipus. But it's also easy to admire that kind of person and maybe even secretly wish that we could be them, or at least be more like them. But this play is a reminder, as the chorus tells us at the end, that good fortune doesn't last forever, and neither does bad fortune. People's roles in life reverse. And this is something I think that's often forgotten. If we think about the realm of economics and politics, there's a lot of resentment and anger towards the 1%. We hear that term a lot, the 1%, or hoarding the wealth. But that 1%, with very few exceptions, is a fluid collection of people. People are falling out of it and new people are rising up into it from year to year. It's never the same group of billionaires or whatever. There's always a new faces. And that's because nobody ever stays on top permanently. The top dog one week might fall and someone else will rise. The chorus in Oedipus the King says this. It's addressing what would have been the original audiences here. You that live in my ancestral Thebes, behold this Oedipus, him who knew the famous riddles and was a man most masterful, not a citizen who did not look with envy on his lot. See him now, and see the breakers of misfortune swallow him. Look upon that last day always. Count no mortal happy till he has passed the final limit of his life, secure from pain. So this is a sobering reminder for the ones on top, but also an optimistic reminder for the rest of us. It means that things can change. Circumstances change, and they keep doing that right up to the end of our lives. So never despair, but also don't get cocky. And I think that that'll just about wrap up this video. I hope it gave you all some ideas to consider, and thank you for watching.